Today's Pokemon Theory contest entry is a bit different and very unique among almost all of my contest entries. This person seems convinced they know the truth about Cubone, and they've gone quite in depth about it. So if this interests you, make sure you sign in, like and share the video, as your likes are votes on whether or not this contest video should win. Let me know what you think about these contest videos. You can check the information about the contest in the card, and with that, we'll just jump right into the video. Hello and welcome back to Pokemon Theory, the show where Professor Oak really isn't a professor, and going to the gym doesn't mean pumping iron. Unless you're in Dewford Town, which is a literal gym.
Anyway, given that generations 1 and 2 were sort of like my generation, I've always been a little partial to Pokemon in those generations, and Cubone and Marowak, although certainly not nearly as popular as, say, Pikachu or Charizard. There have actually been a couple of favorites of mine. Oh, who wouldn't love a little lizard thing that beats its enemies bloody with a bone club and wears its mother's own skull as a helmet? I can honestly say, though, that I never actually wondered what was underneath his helmet until years ago I noticed it popping up on the YouTube. But today, we're gonna learn the truth. Probably. Now, there's two prominent schools of thought that I've run into, and there's this one separate theory which I think bears mentioning given its greater detail, and now I think we should quickly review. Now, I'm just going to kind of skim through these, and if you really want the whole enchilada, I would recommend that you go and watch these videos about these theories yourself. They are excellent. First, that Cubone is a baby Kangaskhan. Now, lots of folks published videos about this, and many of us are probably familiar with the two sprite comparisons of a baby Kangaskhan posed identically next to a sad little Cubone. And yes, there is some resemblance. Well, if you look at them, they're about the same size, kind of dinosaur-like. Got the canine teeth on Kangaskhan. They sort of match up quite nicely to the skull helmet Cubone wears, which, according to the anime and the Pokedex entries, is the skull of Cubone's mother. So the thought is that a Kangaskhan's mother died, baby then used its own mother's bones to better enable it to survive, as a final gift, sort of, from mama to baby. And eventually, it evolves from sad little Cubone into tough, slightly bigger Marowak. Second, and very much the same sort of scenario, we have Cubone being, in fact, a unique evolution of Charmander. Now, Protomario and Loxton did a video about this back in 2014, and they said perhaps when a baby Charmander's Charizard mother dies before it can light baby's tail flame, its bright colors fail to develop, and it cannot use any fire attacks, and instead opts to utilize its mother's bones for defense, wearing mama's head as a helmet and a long bone for a whooping stick. Now, eventually it also grows to a point where it then evolves into Marowak. Again, a very similar kind of circumstance. It's an orphaned whatever, and then eventually turns into Marowak after having been a Cubone. Now, skull formerly worn as a helmet, though, then becomes one with the Pokemon's own body in both cases. Finally, there is a spin, sort of, on the Kangaskhan theory from the general space. Really just has a lot more detail, but it says again, yes, Cubone is a Kangaskhan, but he goes into greater detail again. I haven't really seen detail like this anywhere else, and it's got some compelling evidence, I think, for how and why this could be, going far beyond, them just merely being orphans of species X or Y. So we're going to get into some zoology a little bit here. Now, in the Pokemon world, there are only female Kangaskhan. Now, he presents that essentially Kangaskhan are sort of hardcore survival of the fittest types, sort of Mandalorian-esque, maybe Spartan-like. And they place a tremendous amount of value on strength of both the individual and the herd. Now, this is backed by the Pokedex entries stating that it won't run from any fight to protect its young, it will never give up during battle, no matter how badly wounded it is, and so on. And this mentality has sort of spawned some very Darwinian behaviors in Kangaskhan as a species. He hypothesizes that the male offspring are automatically rejected, but Kangaskhan females can, of course, mate with others in their egg group and still produce a baby Kangaskhan. Now, if they have the power to choose their own mate, they can ensure that they pick the most fit individual available in order to produce the strongest Kangaskhan possible. Now, female offspring are not automatically rejected like the males are, but if a baby girl's mother should die, it's rejected for its mother's apparent weakness because, after all, if it died, it wasn't strong enough to survive. And in this way, Kangaskhan in any given group will always be as strong as they possibly can be. benefiting their entire species as a whole. Remarkable. To my further delight, he goes on to say something I kind of thought about, but I don't recall ever having heard this presented, which is that the action of wearing the helmet and holding the bone club is what in fact triggers a legitimate Pokemon evolution. That is to say that it evolves into a completely different species altogether. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? Because there's a lot of other Pokemon that evolve when either you use an item on them, like an evolution stone, or you give them an item to hold. So it makes perfect sense, right? The mechanism is clearly present in the world. Now, this is an important distinction. See, I never really actually heard anybody say that I can remember. I mean, they just say, you know, underneath the bone helmet is a Kangaskhan or a Charmander. But if it is an actual evolutionary criteria which causes them to change, this could really provide a good explanation for why Cubone has some anatomical differences between its progenitor species, if you will, and there are a few. There's the coloration.
There's the skull shape and size.
Spinal protrusions.
And the number of toes.
Those thumb claws he's got there.
Yeah, you gots to be reaching quite a bit to say that Cubone is actually Kangaskhan or Charmander if you actually notice these things.
Again, I am really just kind of going through the main points here to review, so if you want the whole lowdown with a lot more detail, go on and watch those videos for yourself. It is definitely worth it if you're into this kind of thing. There is some trouble with these ideas, though, and it's evidence in both the games and the anime. You see, there's instances where Cubone's mother is identified as Marowak, and in particular, in Pokemon Origins, Cubone is shown with its mother, a Marowak, and furthermore, Marowak can breed in the games and give birth to a Cubone, which already has the skull, and of course, the Marowak that you just bred does not die. This would seem to nullify the idea that Cubone picked up its mother's skull because it already had the skull, and again, its mother is still alive. Now, the General Space kind of addresses this. He says that perhaps the skull helmet is in the genetic code of Marowak and can pass it on to its offspring, therefore it's born with it, right? It was born this way, your ship was born this way. Now, the evidence for Cubone's relation to Kangaskhan seems to be stacking pretty heavily now, and even more so because, as is often cited in Pokemon Sun and Moon, when Cubone calls for help, there's a small chance that a Kangaskhan will appear. Now, this could easily be just a meaningless Easter egg from developers, but I think, in any case, it's actually not that out of the ordinary, regardless of whether or not Cubone is related to Kangaskhan. Now, the thing is, there's some other Pokemon that can call out for allies of a different species, but they're Pokemon which can be found in the same vicinity or biome as the one making the call. Now, since Generation 1, Cubone and Kangaskhan can be found together in the same general areas. You can find parts of the Safari Zone, I remember, and Cubone and Marowak are also shown next to each other in this picture I've seen before. Can you pull that up for me, Ben? Now, we also know from the anime that most Pokemon are actually quite willing to help out other Pokemon, especially if they live in the same area, and especially if they are of a similar or the same type. That is, as long as they're not in some sort of predator-prey relationship. Altruism. Still with me? Alright, so now that we've gone through a nice little review, we still have the question. Alright, what is the truth? Now, the Charmander and Kangaskhan theories are very interesting. What is this thing? But I believe the answer, my squishy friends, is neither. But, as things often are, the answer has been right in front of us this whole time. Cubone's true identity beneath that lovely little helmet of his is Cubone. Alright, I know others have said it before. Something like, oh, it's obvious, dude. Just keep it simple, bro. Obviously, his mother is just a Marowak and Cubone's just Cubone, duh. You're thinking too much, haha. But I've never heard any of these detractors answer the very important question of why is that Cubone just Cubone? And here we go, baby. Fiction is often based on reality, and in fact, some of the best fiction, because let me tell you, having roots in the real world makes it a lot more relatable to a person. Now, if we consider the Pokemon world, it's got a lot of things in it based on our own. And not just that, a lot of Pokemon are based on actual living creatures or legends or objects, and in some cases they're just outright copies, at least visually. But say, even South America is in the Pokemon world, okay? Whole continent, just it's in there. Having said this, I believe we need to take a look at this with an eye on both real world logic and Pokemon world logic, knowing, yes, all too well that the two are gonna contradict themselves sometimes. So this could get a little bumpy for the old head brain. It sure has been for mine. The popular theories rely pretty heavily on resemblance between Cubone and other Pokemon, but what if I told you that there's a concept in our own world which is of great significance to biologists, zoologists, taxonomists since probably the Middle Ages, although I guess it probably didn't have a name back then. But this thing is called Convergent evolution. That is a phenomenon where two different, sometimes totally unrelated organisms develop similar characteristics or strategies for doing X or Y or Z. For example, a lot of birds fly. Now there's also a lot of arthropods that fly, and they're not related at all. Now, if we also consider there's these flying mammals. Ever hear of a bat? Not related in the slightest to birds or arthropods, but still, they have all three of these groups independently developed this ability of flight. Hedgehogs have specialized pointy hairs on their backs to protect themselves, but then we also have things like porcupines, which also have stiffened, pointy hairs to protect themselves, and they're really not related to those hedgehogs at all. And even further removed, the lovely echidnas from Australia, mate, also unrelated. Consider also penguins and dolphins. One is a bird, one is a mammal, but they have both independently developed very similar body shapes, which is very advantageous for them for swimming around in the water for fast-paced hunting. Hydrodynamic, baby. So this is the explanation for why Cubone's body physically resembles that of Charmander or Kangaskhan. Now they also have the body type of things like Nidoking, Rhydon, and Aggron, and they even share typing with a couple of those, but neither of them are probably close relatives to Cubone. Probably. As a little out-of-universe side note, many of you probably watching are aware that a lot of Pokemon designs took inspiration from dinosaurs. And one of the first ever created, or actually, I think he was actually the first ever created, was Rhydon. And that was before even a single line of code was written for Pokemon Green, to my understanding. Now, that isn't to say, though, that some Pokemon couldn't conceivably be closely related, which actually could help better explain a lot of the physical similarities you see between unrelated Pokemon, and also sort of the overlap of usable attacks, as well as, I think in particular, Pokemon's really weird breeding. I mean, seriously, trying to make sense of the egg groups, it'll out your brain, alright? Because in our world, two creatures as drastically different as, say, like Lickitung and Snorlax should not be able to get it on and have successful, viable offspring. But using the logic built up in the Pokemon world, this egg thing actually isn't as crazy as it may seem. So if we consider Mew, he supposedly, okay, contains all of the DNA of every Pokemon, which allows it to learn any attack or ability, and has also led some Pokemon researchers to believe it's a common ancestor to all the Pokemon. Now, the fact that Mew are apparently still around is a pretty good indication also that maybe there's not a lot of difference between some of the species of Pokemon, as one might think anyway, just looking at them, right? And given how quickly Pokemon can evolve in the in-world sense, this could also mean that new species can develop over a much shorter period of time than we're familiar with in the real world. Now, all this Mew business, again, it kind of makes the egg groups a lot easier to accept. Segue. At least the anime and the Pokédex leads us to believe that the egg groups make more sense. Which brings us to the final straw. The Pokédex pretty clearly indicates, and the anime also indicates, that Cubone always wears its mother's skull on its head. But in the anime, Cubone is shown with its living mother, a Marowak. So how can it wear its mother's skull and its mother still be alive at the same time? And if it's wearing its mother's skull, why doesn't the helmet on Cubone look like the head of a Marowak? This is where I think it bears looking again at their relationship to the real world and some issues in the Pokédex entries. Now, I prefer for things to be direct. You know, this is your friend, this is your enemy, this is north, this is south. See, when things start to get a little gray, they can cause some trouble. Yes, I would absolutely love to be able to take every word the Pokédex says as 100% valid. But, you know, the reality is that there's gray absolutely everywhere, including in the Pokemon world. You know, you'd think something called the Pokédex would be a source of unquestionable fact, right? But the entries found in there are not always so clear, and I think Cubone is one of those. Let's consider Mew again for a moment. Here are some of his entries in the Pokédex.
So rare that it is still said to be a mirage by many experts. Only a few people have seen it worldwide.
Tauros trash. Okay, we all know that Mew does exist and it's not a mirage, but the entry uses this phrase, "It is said to be a mirage by many experts," as in, it's unclear, but a lot of people think Mew isn't real. And then some strange wording again.
Mew is said to possess the genetic composition of all Pokemon.
So, do we not know if Mew has all the Pokemon DNA? We just think that maybe it does. I mean, it's not unreasonable to think that if so few people have ever seen it, then likely even fewer have been able to study it, and therefore it should be largely unknown. But apparently enough knowledgeable people have said they think it possesses all the Pokemon DNA to have it included in a lot of Generations Pokédex entries. Let's talk about Gyarados for a moment.
Gyarados, the atrocious Pokemon, a water and flying type. Rumors exist of a town that made Gyarados angry. That town was burned to the ground in one night, leaving no trace.
This same idea is repeated across various games in the Pokédex, sometimes sweeping away this little single rumor and saying outright that it can level cities all the time, including what it calls major cities. Here's some more.
Rarely seen in the wild, huge and vicious, it is capable of destroying entire cities in a rage. Brutally vicious and enormously destructive, known for totally destroying cities in ancient times. Extremely vicious and horribly brutal, has enough destructive power to totally annihilate even a major city. In ancient literature, there is a record, emphasis on a as in a single instance, of a Gyarados that raised a village when violence flared.
Alright, let's be real. A Gyarados Hyper Beam is powerful. And they're generally a very tough Pokemon for sure. But as far as leveling entire cities goes, I cannot find any evidence of this ever happening in the anime, the manga, or the games, nor do I have any personal memories of such. Now, it's possible that I missed something, yes. That would be super cool, though. This case in particular seems a little bit
A
far-fetched.
sprig of green onions
No,
and
not-
herbs is its weapon.
Never mind. Now, you might think I've gone off in the weeds here. I need to establish that the Pokédex is not necessarily a reliable source, and these cases are evidence of this. Now, This isn't to say that we should completely disregard the Pokédex. Maybe developers just weren't thinking about whether or not these things made sense, or maybe what's happened with the Dex is that it's just kind of fallen prey to the common human practices of exaggeration and attempting to make sense of things they do not fully understand. The latter of which, of course, has been taking place since the beginning of time. There's some people who posit that ancient tales of things like gods and angels descending from the heavens are actually this sort of rationalization by earlier humans to explain extraterrestrial life visiting or crashing on Earth in spacecraft. But that last one is actually how I got here, so. The real point here is that although Cubone's Dex entries state that they wear their mother's skull, sometimes saying that they always do, the Pokédex is not 100% credible, and perhaps we should take this one in particular as myth, especially if we consider again that Cubone has been depicted next to its living mother, Marowak, at the same time. I mean, that's like absolute proof that those particular entries cannot be entirely true. Most likely, the misinterpreted anecdotal observations of a small number of individuals became popular enough, even though they were not fully understood or proven, as also happens with events in the real world to this very day. Also consider again that in the games, when you breed to produce a Cubone, the mother does not die. I mean, maybe this is just for the sake of gameplay, or maybe Cubone being cursed to always be the son of a motherless dinosaur is just a tall tale. This warrants additional research. Now, I'm all for Professor Oak launching a campaign to train and deploy observers to exclusively follow a bunch of Cubone 24/7 until there's absolute clarity. We can say for certain, however, that whatever's going on with Cubone, he is definitely, in fact, 100% wearing that thing like a helmet. You can see in the anime a scene where Pikachu jumps on a Cubone's head, spins the thing around his head, so this were a permanently affixed part of his head anatomy like a true horn or a keratinous horn or a casque. This wouldn't be possible. I would guess though, maybe it develops and behaves like an antler where the bony helmet grows from Cubone's own head, but once the growth reaches its natural point of maturity, it loses its blood supply and becomes a sort of dead piece of bone just kind of stuck there on the head. Now in the case of antlers, they eventually shed, they fall off, and in Cubone's case, it simply is no longer maybe affixed to its actual physical head. It's just there, and then one day it evolves into Marowak when its head is also the helmet. Certainly an improvement. Recap. The theories about Orphan Kangaskhan and Charmander are very interesting, but I don't think they're correct. It's a lot more likely the reason they have phenotypic similarities between those and other Pokemon is simply due to convergent evolution. And you know, while the Pokédex can have useful and accurate information, there's data in there which seems to contradict itself or otherwise just be false. And as such, we cannot necessarily take everything it says as 100% truth. Now, I think this is the case with Cubone. That is to say that Cubone may actually be born with a helmet, and regardless, that there is no possible way that every single Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother. Although I should mention, there are some creatures which are biologically wired to die after reproduction. The Pacific giant octopus comes to mind, but this is most certainly not the case for Marowak. Furthermore, while the details of the exact physiology of the helmet are still unclear, I can say with confidence that in the end, Cubone is simply Cubone. Unless I'm wrong. Shh.
Oh yeah, just brimming with confidence.
And that's about it. I don't think anyone else has presented this idea with as much detail before on this. What is it called again, Ben?
Yeah, it's called YouTube. Blaster brain.
Right. On the YouTube. Okay. Anyway, this is RYN371. Hope you enjoyed. Move along.
Long videos with content that's been covered is always risky. Did they do a good enough job to earn your vote? You let me know with a like and share, and tell me in the comments down below if you think this person nailed it. An interesting way to do a video for sure, especially a Pokemon theory. I've been your host, Protomario, and I'm signing out. As always, good gaming, God bless, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.